Well, thank you so much.
Yeah.
This is the first Friday with Arnold Gordon Bray and Michael Rendler. This is the general and the architect. I'm Andrew Williams Jr., your host. But actually, this is a conversation with Andrew Williams Jr. episode for the Revelation Network, TRN International News. I'm so glad that we have both of you here. So I'll just open the floor first for you, General Bray, to make your introduction. Then perhaps Michael can speak on what we're discussing. And I'll be happy to share my screen, or Michael, you can, if you like to make this a visual as well as verbal. But General Bray, thank you so much for having this first Fridays. And I understand this is our last first Fridays because we're going to first Mondays. And why is that? But General Bray, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Well, first of all, thank you very much. And because of Michael, I've now also made it my casual Fridays, so that one, I can go ahead and throw my heels back a little bit, or kick my heels up, I guess it is. Two things. One is that this is a period of time that we set aside to talk about issues that are relevant to our underserved, underdeveloped, underappreciated, and disenfranchised populations. And it is principally Black and brown folks that we're talking to. We're talking about communities, and so it is not necessarily an issue of color. Obviously, a lot of the issues associated with the U3D, as I call it, is based on some of the impacts of the past. But as you'll hear from Michael here in a few moments, one is that the implications have been rampant. They've taken everything from the weakened education systems, weakened wealth development, weakened health, physical and mental, and in some cases spiritual impacts on these communities. So we're looking at ways we're going to talk about some of the things that are happening, because principally I'm of the ilk that where you stand is where you are. The question is, where you're trying to go. And so we're going to talk about what we are doing across the nation, what we can do across the nation to move forward. We introduce a lot of the organizations that we believe and our participants with to advance this issue. And all of you out there will have somebody, something, some organization that you say, well, they're doing that. Well, the reality is that there are very few organizations in this country that are really doing the holistic kind of discussions and changes that you will hear from Michael and I. And I don't say that from a silo perspective. I say it with some knowledge. I say it with some access to over 1,100 universities while I was in uniform. Admittedly, it's dated. It's been 7 years, but I'm actively tied into some of the things that the Housing and Urban Development are doing right now. I'm actively involved with communities in Kansas City, Los Angeles, Houston, and the rural parts of North Carolina and South Carolina and a well on the East Coast to see what's happening. So I hear all the conversations. I even have attended multiple White House versions of trying to attack this beast holistically, but very few are really doing it holistically, and even worse, very few have been resourced or have the teams to go forward. Along with my colleague, Michael Rendler, we've been playing around this area now for almost 7 years. Hard to believe, Mike, I know. But to try to find ways to advance the issues associated with trying to elevate, for the business person, a population that you have never exploited except for some of the service projects that you want. And for the academic and best of the nation, the people that you have celebrated, you think are extreme examples. I'm a general officer. I will tell you, I'm average. I was average in my neighborhood. I was average in my schools. And so had we had the kinds of population and attention applied If you think I'm okay, or you think I turned out okay, I would say watch who was around me and you'd be amazed. And so we're going to try to change that perspective. We're going to try to talk about how to do that, how to elevate, how to bring people who are sometimes overlooked into the forefront and make sure that we truly do not leave any of our children behind, any of our people that we even missed back into the fold for all the talent that they possess. And with that said, one of the great environmentalists of our nation, one of the great people who talks about architecture in both a human, a scientific, and a more importantly, an educational perspective, Mr. Michael Rendler.
Yeah. So I was thinking a lot about our conversation today and what's been happening in the last month since we kind of assembled, if you will, and started this narrative. And this premise of whole of community and how we need to get the right people around the table to understand a fairly complex concept is pretty challenging, because most of our municipalities and our workforce development models and our education models have defined things by discipline. And when you try to go across disciplines, there aren't very many people that really have the breadth of awareness. And I don't say knowledge, because I think the knowledge is now in the internet and in YouTube, and the ways of learning are really different than when we were students. So having that comprehension of this interconnectedness of these disciplines is really the challenge at hand. Because I sent a letter yesterday about the environment, and the environment is a big word, but it actually, there's been many studies done for a number of years that the environment affects the human behavior, and a discarded environment is a discarded human being. And the results of that discarding, if you will, or lack of attention, is now manifested in Los Angeles in a very, very large, very, very toxic, unhoused community. And this unhoused community is a symptom of a system that is at its roots where the discarding actually starts with the youth. And so us being able to, kind of focus this term that we talked about last time, a pipeline, and looking at a system of inputs, outputs, and outcomes, and putting environment in the middle of that narrative, it requires this not only whole community to come together, but will require these agencies within our federal model, our state model, our local municipalities to actually coalesce around what are the real priorities. And this Measure J that's in Los Angeles right now, 30% of the county budget focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion, is the beginning of us trying to reconstruct, reassemble, if you will, what General Bray is talking about, where real opportunity is, and moving into this 21st century learning paradigm and learn to work model. And so I think that the work we're doing with the Housing Authority now in Los Angeles, in Watts, and its partnerships with the Strategic Growth Council, a division of the California Energy Commission, with what they call TCC grant, Transformative Climate Community Grant, puts the environmental narrative dead center in how we will transform this diversity, equity, and inclusion conversation. So I'm super optimistic that Los Angeles has done some really remarkable things, and I'm really honored to be working with this 360 Cradle to Careers team to try to look at what the consortium model of having the right constituents around the table to have this transformative model come online. And so we were talking a little bit earlier before we started the recording of some papers that have been generated to look at this reentry population with our Department of Parole. And I think that's another one of the symptoms of some of the systemic decision-making that was made earlier, that people left school, left family, ended up in, incarceration. Now we realize that some of the incarceration was probably unnecessary due to its association with drugs that are now legal in many states in the United States. So, we're kind of revisiting what this whole idea is of building community, building society. So I'm hopeful in this conversation today that we touch on this unhoused population, HUD's relationship to that, and what genuine economic development could look like, should look like around this STEM initiative: science, technology, engineering, and math, because I think that that's a methodology of exploration that has a whole new frontier out in front of us. And I think there's a lot of things that we'll be able to do with that. You're muted there, General Bray.
I said, we're not going to rebeat all these horses that we beat every week, but there are some things that will continue to show up. One is holistic. Two is the cold down tiers of what equals holistic, the pillars, if you will. But we believe, and I say we, Michael and I have spent years looking at what are the holistic lines of effort or pillars. And since we provided our thoughts early on to HUD, and HUD has kind of come back and recognized that they acknowledge 4 pillars, which are character, leader development, physical and mental health, education, specifically science, technology, engineering, and math focused education, and health, wealth and financial literacy as being critical to changing a life and a community's lives. We buy into that. But we also recognize that communities with, even though the targeted area of focus is usually the youth, and more specifically, youth in the ranges of low middle school to 24-ish time period. What they sometimes forget are the role models that are around you that help augment the way you think. And in many cases, many of these role models missed a gate, or worse, they were influenced by someone in that gate whose values were not necessarily where their parents would like them to be or what society accepts. And they were incarcerated. And by the way, I do not dismiss any kind of drug abuse. In a similar fashion, I acknowledge that alcohol is also a drug. And I make sure people understand that. Alcohol is a drug as well. And do I participate? Absolutely. The problem is that one is sometimes when people say, if you do or do not accept marijuana, it's somehow in people's minds, it's something very different. And while there are some differences, the reality is that we are in that same space that we were with alcohol back in the late 20s when prohibition existed. There are so much of our population is making that choice to use it. And its cost of use is less impactful or co-equal impactful to alcohol. And we have drunken drivers that kill folks every day. Yet there are some people that see it as somehow different, somehow different. They're in the same boat. They make you basically lose your judgment. Why do I even bring that up? Many of our young incarcerated people of color have been victim, if you put it in mind, been victim of essentially drinking in the 20s. There are so many talented minds that have been missed. These kids who've been incarcerated, these kids who have a record of some sort associated with alcohol, with drug or alcohol abuse, may potentially have been someone of much greater worth. What I will tell you, in many cases, they are already influencers in the community. So if you don't address them, and more specifically, especially those who've been caught, did their time, and came back into the community, if you don't address them, you're putting in free, and I'm going to use one of Michael's terms, free radicals back into your equation of change. And you have to address them. One of our great partners, especially in Los Angeles, is Mr. Bray Carson. His desire and ability to attack recidivism or preventing the return of people who've been introduced to the system is phenomenal. Because the first thing you have to do is you have to increase their worth, and then you have to give them something that makes them be able to earn, make a livable earning, give them a new pathway once they come back in. Because let's be fair, they did not stand still from where they were when they entered prison. They entered into a culture. They became part of a new group of people and connections that if you don't introduce change, what we do is we start a whole new cycle of change. And those kids we're trying to change will be influenced and they'll move to something else. So all of our discussions are about this idea of holistic change. I talked about some organizations that you heard Michael mention, specifically a group that we both helped to emerge called 360 Cradle to Careers. Its name has been something else, just similar to the organization that Michael and I first dreamed up in Las Vegas, All In Model, has the same purpose, which is to really reach out and grab those elements that can help influence those 4 pillars of character leader development, financial literacy, education, and physical and mental health. We're looking to change those things, and then more specifically, we're using HUD, who has a staff programs, a staff responsibility to be the primary agent of change to bring in most of America and bring and elevate the lower evaluated parts of America. And then let's go back and so if I use the term U3D one more time, you guys will hear it. It's underserved, underrepresented, undervalued, and disenfranchised parts of our nation. Didn't have a color, but it's specifically that. That's how we look at the change. The part that Mike, Dr. Rendler, really focuses on and does a tremendous job is he introduces tools. Specifically, he talks about the tools that can be leveraged in education, whereby inductive reasoning becomes essential with the tool of using the environment to basically enthuse people to learn, so that the person who never saw him or herself as an engineer is encouraged into engineering, encouraged into that process by allowing them to work a problem that they are interested in, and then being taught, given the tools to figure out how to make that change. Very powerful in what he's doing. There's a gentleman that they have introduced this process that also looks at how to bring in some of those who've made the mistake, been put behind bars, But oh, by the way, also started to change inside the bars for both the good and the bad's not there, but the good is there because many of them weren't educated. And he talks about the miseducation. He talks about failure to learn because it wasn't just learning the academics, it was learning the character portions of life. And the two go hand in hand. And I hope some of you out there are familiar with Freeway Rick, who is a former billionaire that was a functional illiterate, went to jail, did 20 years, where he was educated in prison and came out becoming almost evangelical for education. Because he says, had he learned, he would have been a different person. And I believe him now. What that different person is, that's up to him to really articulate. But I clearly think he would have been the kind of person that would have probably made a more positive change in America and not been necessarily associated with Ollie North and that piece of American history that is infamous for left and right hand dealings. So as Mike starts to talk more here, he goes into his 8-step model of education. And it is all centered around this idea of putting a person in an immersive real world environment that looks at his or her community for change, that describes where they are, describes who's there, describes what they need to sustain life, what they need to also advance toward careers. Hence why he and I got involved in 360 Cradle to Careers, taking those 4 pillars to move forward, to join both the political leadership and the business leadership of communities, because everything that we do that keeps somebody off the street, that makes them less of a danger to their community, because as most of us know, I think most of us know, prisons are built based upon the literacy percentages of a community in, wait for it, third grade. So if we can go ahead and improve that side of education, improve the enthusiasm of education, improve the literacy of our kids, the ability to also think like scientists, not be scientists, think like scientists, which is a rational thought process, we can help change our communities and our world. And again, I hate to rattle, but this is really the core of all of our discussions. How it spins off, how it goes to different parts of the tangentials is another thing. You know, I mentioned U3D. We're gonna talk in one of our sessions. We're gonna talk a little bit about the African diaspora, because if you don't believe that we're interconnected and we're into a global society, you're absolutely crazy. Because we're training our kids right now not to compete with the kid next community, not to have the kids in Compton compete with the kids over in Crenshaw. We're talking about having the kids to compete with the kids in Los Angeles, South Carolina, Houston, and Beijing, because that's what we've got to compete with. If you ever do anything with Geek Squad, half the time you go into the Geek Squad, you're not talking to anybody in the United States. You're talking to some kids in India who are working on your computer from over there. And oh, by the way, they're getting employed for peanuts because they can. But their minds are agile. Oh, by the way, as soon as they get their sea legs underneath them and they give an opportunity to get over here, they do. And then they start to make significantly more money than they had before. One of our goals is to make sure that our kids become those kids. Our kids become the ones that also have the innovative thought that goes with being an American. And let them know that they compete. Give them the tools so they can compete. And get them to start not looking across the street with the guy with the spinners and the shiny wheels and the roll of money in his hand, but the one that has the money in his bank, because he's not worried about the IRS looking at it. And he has a car that is functional, safe, and reflective of his status in life. That's a character issue that is, if it isn't fixed, what you will have is you have them chasing that dollar. Hill Harper has a great book that's been out for a couple of years now. It's called Letter to a Young Brother. And in it, he uses mathematics to show you what a lifespan is supposed to be. Then he shows you the kids that are on the corners of a street who are making money, impressive big money. But then he shows you their lifespan. And when you finish doing it, the average, what it looks like is a person that's hustling really earns about $1.65 an hour, because he never gets a full life. And what it doesn't even discuss very much is the fact that his head is always on a swivel, looking out to see who's looking at him, to see who's trying to get revenge for something that he didn't do, whether it's law or, as Big U from the Crips says, homies who's trying to get back. Oh yes, and I talk to everybody in case you didn't figure that out. But it's all about making sure that you understand. And I think the folks that we'll have on here kind of understand where we are and where we are in America. Again, I toss the ball back to Michael.
Yeah. So there's a concept that has been utilized, and it comes from a woman in the 1960s, Jane Jacobs, Eyes on the Street, and the term is CPTED, which stands for Crime Prevention Through Environmental Design. I'm changing that acronym from crime prevention to community protection. So the idea that we as a community look out for each other and how that works is something now in Los Angeles, they're using this premise of Eyes on the Street to actually talk about something the military has been involved with for a long time, encampments. And so clearing these homeless encampments, we had a discussion with the police captain about a week ago with how they're applying a tool to eventually get to an artificial intelligence or best practice. And what came out of the discussion was, we're looking at our environment through this lens that we want to have eyes on the street. We want to look out for each other, and we want to know where the best, quote, interventions can take place within our community. But what was kind of challenging for me personally was these concepts and this narrative had been presented through the teaching I do at USC and the Safe Community Institute. And the premise is that there's a single source of truth to make decisions. And if we don't have a comprehensive model, if we don't have an information system that has these, what we're talking about today, these interdependencies, these interconnectedness, this wholeness in nature, it's going to be really, really difficult for us to do any kind of what's called predictive performance model. And so this is something that we feel is in the domain of the community, which means how do these public housing projects under something called choice neighborhood initiatives actually do inclusion? And so when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, the equity can be a component of this financial literacy, a component of this capital empowerment. But the idea of inclusion in a narrative that has a level of complexity. And I think that this tool set that the police captain is talking about is really a tool set that can empower the community. So General Bray referenced an 8-step. I don't like the word step. Him and I have gone around in a circle a few times about there's always a beginning, Michael. You have to accept there's a step 1, step 2. I like to talk about synergies. I like to talk about objects. I use an object called a cube. And in that cube, there's 8 vertexes. None of those vertexes are more important than any other one. And therefore, when you look at this, you have to look at, although it's delivered sequentially as a 8-component framework, the idea is that there's an interdependency. And this interdependency is how you actually look at efforts, or what General Bray would call lines of force. And so when we start to talk about what is the right way, what is the best way, what is the most efficient way to come at this problem, we know without any doubt, and this is well scientifically proven, more eyes on the problem, the better the solution. And this has been proven with open source software. It's well documented. So this idea of clandestine, closed, small circle networks to actually talk about what engagement looks like is counterproductive. And so our hope is that we start to bring the community into this more complex environment, digital environment specifically, and as General Bray said, not leaving anyone behind. What does that look like for a 5th grader? What does that look like for a 9th grader? And how do we actually provide an environment within a community that obviously visually has been marginalized into a legitimate narrative of social empowerment? And so as we talk about this with HUD, and we talk about this with our what we call in Los Angeles, our neighborhood council, these become a very challenging conversation. So I'm going to pass it back over to General Bray. Seems I got a little background noise here. So just for the audience, I think that'd be good. If we respond to this idea of SEPTET, crime prevention, community protection through environmental design. It's not a new concept, but I think it's a worthwhile narrative for us being able to build our environmental connections that we need to be thinking about in this climate change environment.
You know, the other thing I mentioned earlier is that the reason why the United States is so central to so much, especially when you're referencing or talking about issues associated with color. One need only look at an indiscriminate, a person who in other times would have just been an average guy on the street who lost his life in the upper Midwest, but he lost it on TV. And people had a first chance to see many people had a first chance to see somebody die innocently on their lives, in their eyes. While the person himself was not necessarily an innocent life every day in all things, at that moment, at that time, he was absolutely innocent. Having gone now to the site of that death and seeing the commercialization of what transpired at that site, I'm reminded of something that even in my faith, Jerusalem has been commercialized, but it changed the world. Everybody around the world saw him, and his death went viral. His death also made people in literally every part of the world, probably save North Korea and Russia, looking at how the minority people of color were treated and are treated. And once you start going down the rabbit hole of color, you start going down all of the issues associated with disenfranchisement, inferiority, superiority discussions associated with the differences of people. So George Floyd's death actually had that kind of an impact, and because it happened on American soil. I mean, we didn't, Tiananmen Square the stand-up of someone from a different party in China, in communist China, all it did was bring about a condemnation of communism. The awareness of the world to really stand up to that kind of discrimination wasn't reached. You know, I go back to years, the first time I heard a slur about race outside the United States was in South Korea. But it let me know that racism existed in all those places. Today, there is that same discussion occurring, ironically, on the island of Dominican Republic in Haiti. So we now, as a people across the country, recognize that all of us are discriminating, and the race or the perception of race is in our diet, our world, our global diet. And so our ways to change that. First of all, let's look at what mostly happens in that bin of discrimination. Discrimination and prejudice are things that are universal and will always exist. I'm going to say this again. They will always exist. I hope that doesn't sound like it's extremely damaging to the world, but the reality is all it simply is a person making a judgment before they know all the facts. That's just an education process. And then doing actions. This is the sad part. You can train and change this part, the actions based upon that prejudice. That's what the professional mind avoids. That's what we can train out. That's what we're especially going to change out and train out of the people that go to the top of the ladders in all of our professions. Because you can't stop your brain from doing what it does. You can try to train it to give you a pause, but you absolutely can control how you react to it. I sometimes have a drill I do with young people. I walk into the room and have the question posed about me before I walk in, and I have whoever it is going to bring me in, never give them a background on who I am. But I let them walk in and they have to write down 4 or 5 things about who I am. I've only had one student who said, I don't know him, so I can't write anything. More often than not, I'm 6'6", they say basketball player. They also say, and because they know, I let him know that tell them that I'm from South Carolina. So there's an expectation of how I will speak based upon where they've been. It trains us to start looking at those things. So those are the 2 big ones. And then they go through a list of other things that they'll have expectation before then I speak. Then I'll pick somebody to say what their top 5 things that what they said. And I tell them this, no, it's okay, because this is about prejudging. And usually that I would have a strong Southern accent. I'm a basketball player. But I asked how many of them would have said airborne ranger, paratrooper, general? How many of them would have said actually high-end fine artist? And those top 2 never hit the papers. Every now and then, a professor will write down both of those things because he looked up my bio, and he'll go ahead and brag. But the reality is that we all have that. So then we talk about now the trained mind. The trained mind is what this session is about. Helping train your mind to look at those folks from the U3D and start to remember that just as you start to become more professional and realize that there are people out there who are better than you, just they're not as trained as you are. We can start to do something much more powerful in this country than we have before. And I kind of circle back to where I began. This country matters because every other country prior to our existence was associated with the big three: a language, a faith, a shared history, especially after the tribal wars were won. The geography was usually dictated by the war that was fought. This country broke those things down. We had to have a war to fight to talk about this being a United States under those principles. And one of the key principles of what we fought for was the idea that all men, and it should have said, just like Hamilton in the movie says, in the sequel, it should have said all men and women should have been and are created equal. Our discussions, because these United States, we are the shiny city on the hill for most of the world. As the desk officer for the United States Africa Command, even Gaddafi, in his last moments, in the coalition of the willing that existed, begged for the United States to go ahead and become the specific leader that he could negotiate with. So that, one, he could address some of the issues by which his country was being destroyed. Kim Jong-un pimped our last president to get a seat at the world table, when in fact he's a regional player, but not deservedly so, because he only has a couple of elements of power. But all nations want to address this nation because we are not just a United States. We are a microcosm, a tossed salad of the world's people. And more importantly, as this century advances, we're going to have large groups within this country that believe in this ideal, but they're going to come and they're going to be of different faiths. They're going to be multilingual. And they're going to be able to address world issues in a way that most other countries do not. They will not be wedded to a particular history, even though there are those who try to reimagine American history. It's powerful what we can do. And leaders with the trained mind will be able to repress the view, repress the prejudgments, so that as a trained mind, they can ask the question to get to the answers that they really want to know, that comes with the processes associated with thinking through a STEM mindset. It's critical to the change of our nation. And then it goes to Mike's approach, which is to make sure that all of your thought processes are always wrapped around impacts, ideas, what does it mean to, what does it derive from in our environment? And by that thought process, and by the way, Mike, it was you that created steps, not me. I just use your step process. Because I do agree that there is an entry point of everything. The question is, where's that entry point? In fact, his model, which I still like the model, it requires you to come in at your place, and then it takes you back to where you have to be to get to your own end. It's a powerful way of thinking that this thing that Mr. Rendler and his E7 team are trying to create, to shift, to change our education process. You know, as our time starts to wind down a little bit, I would even, I ask educators to read a couple of books that I think are timeless in their approach. There's Carter Woodson's Miseducation of the Negro. It talks about the impacts of culture and the things that are missing. It ties in very well to a lot of what Dr. Rendler talks about in terms of making sure that a person's educated based upon their understanding of the world, because that gives you the basis of a beginning. And then it allows you to take every bit of learning in context, so that everything that you learn and the way you evaluate people are based upon a common basis of understanding of descriptions of things that someone may or may not know about. The second one is one that talks about ownership of a problem, and is associated with W.B. Du Bois and his talented 10. It's an articulation and making sure that everybody owns the problem, and specifically those who are educated having a requirement by virtue of education to elevate our climate, lift our climate. That's what we're doing right now. You know, Mike talked about community, and I know some people, their eyes roll when Mike says the community, because many were saying, okay, here's a white guy, another guy, a PhD doc, talking about the community. Michael Rendler is from one of the rough areas in California, and most particularly Los Angeles. And I say rough, in other words, it has gone through all the gentrification discussions that everybody gets afraid of, because the area he grew up in was predominantly of Black and brown people. And as a matter of fact, at one meeting he went to, and I probably should let him tell the story, but I think I tell it better than he does. Someone asked him where he was from, and he described the area of Los Angeles. And the person says, I'm from there, and there are no white folks in that area. Well, they had absorbed his family so much, this guy had forgotten. And so the guy said, what's your name? He said, Michael Rendler. And the guy pulled back and said, oh, you Dr. Rendler's boy. and because Mike Rendler comes from a family that says, when everybody else was starting to move out, his dad said, this is where we live. This is the world. And he was raised in that environment, but he admittedly, he knows he has white privilege. He also has parental privilege. And more importantly, he has humanity on his side, because he has never stopped giving back or lost humanity in what he's doing. And I hope that in all of your communities around this country, Rendler, you find someone, as I happen to find on the opposite coast, my brother from another color, that is committed or as committed as most of us are to uplift, elevate, and as one of our other teammates would say, excite about the prospect of change. With that said, I will stand by for questions, but I'm going to toss to Mike so he can go and make his closing thoughts.
Well, it's really wonderful, General Bray, that you hold the high ground in the cerebral context of not just what happens to us, but how we process what happens to us, and changing or augmenting the opportunities associated with that to build a brighter and more robust and more human future I think that that's a message that's embedded in our educational model. So thank you. Kudos to you for pointing out that it's really in that post-processing, if you will, of our experiences that will really lend itself to building a new methodology of how we build our society, build our community, and restore our planet. So thank you very much for the discussion.
Andrew, you're up. Are you reading questions? Mike, you think Andrew went to sleep on us?
No, he's probably on the phone. He's a multitasker if there ever was one. And you talk about a gentleman who's 100% committed to this conversation. This is a man 24/7 focused on trying to improve the human condition. So I guess maybe he doesn't know he's muted, possibly. He probably has a bunch of things he'd like to say, but we can't hear him right now. So
while Andrew starts to try to find his mute button, one of the other things that Andrew has done and has done is he works with the African diaspora, and it really kind of goes to this other issue that we're talking about, the impact of the United States, and more specifically, the impact of the United States Black population. There's a move afoot to try to link all the people of African descent and to try to elevate the population, or create that idea of a rising tide raising all ships, and all ships of color becomes pretty important. So one of the things he opened the show with was shifting the date from First Fridays to First Mondays. And the reason why is because December 6th of 2021 falls on a Monday. And it enjoins some other ideas of the African diaspora, but more specifically, in this country, December 6th was the date that Georgia, having just finished fighting the Civil War, also became the 27th state to ratify the 13th Amendment. And for those who love to talk about Juneteenth, there was 250,000 slaves still remaining in bondage. Juneteenth, because Juneteenth is a fulfillment of the Emancipation Proclamation, which was a document designed to free slaves only in the Confederacy. But the 5 states that joined the Union that still retains slavery, specifically Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware, still had slaves until the 13th Amendment was ratified. And that was when the 27th, 3/4 of the existing 35 states signed and accepted the abolition of slavery. And so for that reason, Mr. Carl Mack and I, who's the former president of National Society of Black Engineers, we are pushing forward that on December 6th, every year, we do a Black Freedom and Equality Day, and we celebrate that by patronizing businesses of Black businesses of all kinds. And so we're going to kind of shift as we move towards that end and enjoying the folks in the African diaspora in celebrating on December 6th, which occurs on a Monday this year, and start to shift our attention and discussions to that date. And Andrew, now that I see your face, you can jump on and you have the controls.
Well, thank you so very much. As you may know, technology is only great when it works. So I had to come in on another device. But having said that, I do want to thank both of you for participating with this last First Fridays with the General and the Architect. That's retired General Arnold Gordon Bray and Architect Michael Rendler. It's being brought to you. I'm happy and pleased to be bringing this to you as a series in conversations, Andrew Williams Jr. This is sponsored by the edfoodfoundation.org, as well as Universal Citizens Media Network and the Revelation Network, where TRN International News will be rebroadcasting these series. But Michael Rendler, I'll have you to know that we're live streaming. I was able finally to get that done on Facebook on the Encounter Think Tank for the Decade of Action on the Sustainable Development Goals. So I want to ultimately thank Professor Marcela Oliva of the Los Angeles Trade Technical College for the Department of Architecture and Environmental Design. It was technically that brain trust that is a community advisory board and think tank that was formally launched in the December of 2012, or I should say relaunched, and included myself.
You went to mute. You went to mute, Andrew. You're muted, Andrew.
Andrew, we can't hear you. Unmute yourself.
Involved with global business incubation, and specifically the GBI Emerald veterans. In that regard, I also invited later Dr. Paul Ruffin, who is now championing that. However, the idea that we are bringing to
Went back to mute, Andrew.
Andrew, whatever you're touching, you're muted again. Yeah, you're no voice, no sound.
technology, and I may even have to shift back to another device so that I won't be interrupted. But this is part of what happens in real life. so
Well, Mike, all those who are there, wish I could see the chat line. Can you see the chat line, Mike?
I don't see anything in the chat. No, I don't see anything. Andrew hasn't posted anything.
I'm here again. Thank you so much. But I'm going to formally end this recording and then begin again. So let me do that right now. I'm going to end the recording now, and we're going to go to part 2 or not.